The flashing red and blue lights shattered the quiet of the suburban street. Tires squealed as a uniformed officer stepped out, hand on his gun, eyes narrowing at the man who had just parked. A decorated four-star general in the U.S. Army, his medals glimmering under the streetlights, now faced an accusation that made no sense. The officer's voice trembled with authority and fear, or was it contempt? Every passerby froze, sensing the tension, sensing the injustice. And then, the general reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, his fingers trembling, and made a call that could change everything. If you want more shocking stories about injustice and courage, subscribe to my channel, Racism Untold Stories, and never miss a story that exposes the truth. General Marcus Thompson had walked the streets of Washington, D.C. countless times, yet never under such scrutiny. The city that once symbolized opportunity now felt like a maze of silent judgment. Every streetlight cast shadows that seemed to stretch longer than the evening itself. The polished shoes of a man who had served decades in the United States Army clicked sharply against the asphalt, each sound echoing in the quiet suburban neighborhood. He had just returned from a charity gala, an event that celebrated success, achievement, and service. Yet the accolades felt hollow in the face of the suspicion he now encountered. His uniform, immaculate and adorned with medals, reflected the bright glow of streetlights, each insignia representing decades of sacrifices, missions completed, and lives led with integrity. Every inch of him radiated authority, respect, and discipline. And yet, in the presence of a young officer, the symbols of his accomplishments were invisible, reduced to the color of his skin and the assumptions that accompanied it. Marcus had grown up in a neighborhood where hope existed only in whispers. The buildings were weathered, walls peeling, paint chipping under the persistent sun and occasional rain. The air carried the scent of fried food from corner shops, mixed with exhaust from cars whose engines had seen better days. His childhood home had been a small apartment above a laundromat, where the hum of machines and his mother's soft lullabies filled the evenings. He remembered lying on the floor, staring at the ceiling, dreaming of a life far beyond the constraints of his environment. He learned early that determination and intelligence were tools to survive in a world that rarely acknowledged potential in children who looked like him. Discipline had become his shield. From morning drills to long nights studying military history, Marcus absorbed lessons that extended beyond the classroom. He developed the patience to navigate bureaucracies, the foresight to anticipate obstacles, and the resilience to recover from setbacks. Each achievement in his adult life, the promotions, the commendations, the leadership positions, was a testament to these lessons. He had faced prejudice quietly, earning respect through performance, never confrontation. Yet every success carried the weight of having to prove himself repeatedly, as if the world measured his worth by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. The street seemed unnaturally still that night. Neighbors peeked through curtains, some holding their children close, others frozen in fascination at the encounter unfolding. The young officer had stepped out of his patrol car with an authority that felt unearned, eyes scanning the general from head to toe. Marcus could see the tension in his posture, the rigidity in the set of his jaw, the subtle tightening of his hand on the holster. He knew the signs: fear masquerading as authority, prejudice masquerading as lawfulness. Every moment under the gaze of the officer felt like a test, a microcosm of decades of experience condensed into a few tense seconds. The officer's assumptions were unspoken yet deafening. He saw a man in uniform and assumed entitlement was a threat. He saw a black man and presumed guilt. The world Marcus had mastered through discipline and merit did not exist for the officer. In his mind, credentials did not matter, integrity was irrelevant, and the nuanced reality of Marcus's life was invisible. Marcus felt no anger, only the quiet, simmering acknowledgement of a systemic pattern he had encountered countless times before. This was not merely an encounter. It was a reflection of the social structures that defined and confined individuals long before they walked into a street illuminated by flashing lights. Marcus adjusted the cap on his head and let the tension settle in his chest. He had faced hostile environments before, though none quite like this. He recalled missions in foreign territories where danger was visible, predictable, and quantifiable. Here, the danger was subtle, intangible, and deeply rooted in bias. The neighborhood was calm, yet beneath the surface, currents of judgment and assumption flowed, threatening to drown reason in the name of authority. He understood the weight of perception, and he knew the only way to navigate it was with measured calm. Every badge, medal, and stripe on his uniform had been earned in situations that tested courage and judgment. The officer before him had never faced such trials, yet now wielded power over him based solely on perception. The scene was a harsh reminder that merit and achievement do not always shield one from prejudice, that respect can be denied even when it is unquestionably deserved. Marcus could feel the collective gaze of the neighborhood, the silent judgment of those who recognized authority but feared its challenge. He understood the importance of maintaining composure. He knew that any sign of agitation could be twisted into confirmation of the officer's assumptions. His hand rested lightly on the phone in his pocket, the device a small yet potent tool of accountability. It was not a weapon, nor a symbol of privilege. It was a connection to the systems that upheld truth and fairness. Marcus had learned that sometimes intervention required more than words. It required strategy, foresight, and the patience to wait for the right moment. His pulse was steady, though his mind cataloged every detail. The glint of the officer's badge, the tightening of his shoulders, the pattern of shadows cast by the streetlights. Every observation would inform his next move. He thought briefly of his late father, a man who had taught him that courage alone is not enough. One must couple courage with wisdom, patience, and resourcefulness. He had carried those lessons through military academies, battlefield strategy, and Pentagon briefings, and now, standing under the harsh glow of suspicion, he relied on them once more. This encounter was not a battlefield, yet it demanded the same clarity, the same restraint, and the same moral fortitude. Marcus allowed his gaze to sweep across the scene. The crowd of onlookers was small, yet it represented the silent witnesses of society, those who often judge from a distance but rarely act. He understood their hesitation. Fear and societal conditioning can make even the morally upright hesitate in the face of injustice. Yet he also knew that small moments can ripple outward, creating awareness where ignorance once thrived. This street at this moment was a stage for a larger lesson, one that required patience, precision, and integrity. The officer stepped closer, hand subtly brushing the holster, a gesture meant to assert dominance. Marcus did not flinch. His eyes remained calm, steady, observing rather than reacting. Every breath of the city felt charged with unspoken tension, every passing car a reminder of the fragile balance between authority and morality. The general's decades of experience had taught him to remain centered in chaos, to recognize the patterns beneath the surface, and to act only when the time was right. For Marcus, the moment was clear. The lesson, for the officer and for the witnesses, would be delivered without malice, without confrontation, and without haste. The weight of prejudice could be countered with integrity. Assumptions could be dismantled with patience. Authority could be tempered with morality. He reached slowly into his pocket, fingers brushing the cold metal of his phone. The simple act signaling preparedness, not aggression. The city seemed to hold its breath as Marcus prepared to confront the injustice with the quiet force that had defined his life. The scene was electric with anticipation. The young officer, unaware of the life he now challenged, remained poised yet vulnerable. Marcus's presence was both calm and commanding, a reminder that true authority does not demand recognition. It earns it through action and principle. The street became a crucible for truth, prejudice, and moral courage. Marcus understood that the next moments would define not only this encounter, but potentially the understanding of every witness, every observer, and every participant. The city lights flickered as if in acknowledgement, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the future, toward change. Marcus's hand tightened slightly around his phone, a gesture of intent and control. He was ready. The next move would determine the course of the encounter, the validation of truth, and the lesson for a young officer whose assumptions had underestimated the power of experience, wisdom, and moral fortitude. The street remained still, yet the tension was palpable, as if the city itself held its breath. Every passerby, every observer behind curtained windows, sensed the imbalance, the silent injustice unfolding under the glow of the streetlights. General Marcus Thompson's uniform, polished and precise, reflected decades of service, yet to the young officer it meant nothing. To him, Marcus was simply a black man in a position of authority, a challenge to be controlled, a scenario to assert dominance. The officer's fingers hovered near his holster, tension rippling through his rigid frame, his certainty faltering only slightly under the calm, unwavering gaze of the general. Marcus took measured steps, each movement deliberate, composed. His presence radiated authority not through intimidation, but through experience. The crowd of onlookers shifted subtly, instinctively aware that something extraordinary was happening. This was not a casual interaction. It was a collision of perception and reality, of prejudice and integrity, of assumption and truth. The general's posture, upright and resolute, communicated the weight of every battle he had fought, every mission he had led, and every barrier he had overcome to stand in this very moment. The officer's assumptions began to fracture. He had been trained to enforce authority, to follow protocol, to trust in the uniform as a symbol of legitimacy. Yet now, confronted by Marcus's calm composure and the undeniable evidence of his achievements, the young man felt the first stirrings of doubt. Each medal, each stripe, each mark of distinction was a story the officer could not comprehend, a lifetime of discipline and moral responsibility compressed into symbols he had been trained to ignore. The realization was subtle, creeping, yet undeniable. Authority alone did not justify prejudice. Experience alone could command respect. Marcus's hand rested lightly on his phone, the device a quiet instrument of accountability. It was not a weapon nor a threat, but a tool of intervention, a reminder that even the most entrenched bias could be challenged through deliberate action. He did not raise his voice, nor did he make sudden movements. The crowd, sensing his restraint and dignity, leaned inward, drawn by the gravity of the moment. Each passing second amplified the moral tension. The city had become a theater for truth, and Marcus was both the actor and the lesson. The officer's mind raced. He had encountered resistance before, but never from someone whose credentials, achievements, and moral authority could not be disputed. He had assumed control, yet every instinct that justified his authority now seemed hollow. Marcus's calm was a mirror, reflecting the young officer's uncertainty, his bias, and his inability to reconcile perception with reality. The officer's training had emphasized obedience, yet morality demanded pause. It was a collision of systems, one that had been taught through protocol, the other through lived experience and the quiet power of integrity. The neighborhood, once silent, seemed to ripple with awareness. From windows, faces peered out, some horrified at the potential injustice, others inspired by the general's composure. Marcus's presence demanded recognition, not through force, but through the undeniable weight of truth. Every step he had taken in life, every choice, every sacrifice, had led to this confrontation. The lesson he embodied was subtle, yet powerful. Bias could be confronted without aggression. Assumptions could be challenged without anger, and integrity could prevail where authority had failed. In that charged silence, Marcus allowed his gaze to sweep across the scene. The young officer's colleagues lingered in the shadows, uncertain how to respond. Their training had taught them to act swiftly, decisively, and with unquestioned authority. Yet now, they faced a moral paradox. A man of impeccable credentials, a lifetime of service, and calm composure, subjected to suspicion purely because of his race. The disparity between the officer's assumptions and reality was stark. Marcus's presence highlighted the fragility of perception and the power of integrity, exposing the subtle forms of systemic injustice that often go unnoticed. Marcus's mind reflected on the broader patterns of prejudice he had encountered throughout his career. Promotions delayed, opportunities withheld, respect earned grudgingly, assumptions imposed by those who had never walked in his shoes. The young officer was not malicious. He was a product of a system that conditioned individuals to judge superficially, to equate color with guilt, to assume power equaled correctness. In that moment, Marcus understood that the confrontation was not personal, it was systemic. The lesson extended beyond the street, beyond the individual, into the very structures that governed perception, authority, and morality. The officer's hesitation grew. Each movement, each glance revealed the internal struggle between training and conscience, between assumption and truth. Marcus's calm composure magnified the contrast. Where the officer relied on authority to assert control, Marcus relied on integrity to assert reality. The moral imbalance was clear. The one presumed guilty carried decades of honor, and the one presumed righteous teetered on the precipice of embarrassment and moral awakening. Every onlooker could sense the reversal of roles. Marcus's phone, resting lightly in his pocket, became a silent promise. It was not an instrument of privilege, but of accountability. He could summon verification, corroboration, and intervention. The device symbolized preparedness and moral responsibility, demonstrating that justice was not passive. It could be activated through deliberate, principled action. The officer, aware, yet uncertain, sensed the shifting balance of power. For the first time in the encounter, he hesitated fully, recognizing that the presumptions he had relied on were insufficient to justify his actions. The scene became electric with moral tension. Breath visible in the cold night air seemed heavier, thicker, as if the city itself acknowledged the unfolding lesson. Marcus's calm presence contrasted with the rising anxiety of the officer, a visual testament to the potency of integrity. Every medal, every insignia, every aspect of his bearing conveyed decades of experience, sacrifice, and moral clarity that no uniform could replicate. The crowd, though silent, felt the weight of the lesson. Authority could be questioned, assumptions dismantled, and prejudice exposed without a single word being spoken. Marcus allowed his gaze to meet the officer's directly. It was not a stare of challenge, nor a gaze of anger, but one of quiet assertion. The message was clear. Actions, assumptions, and perceptions must align with reality, and when they do not, the consequences are not merely personal. They are systemic. The officer's knuckles whitened on the holster, tension radiating from every limb. Yet he could not act without accountability, could not advance without recognition of the truth in front of him. Minutes stretched, each one intensifying the moral suspense. Marcus's experience in high-pressure situations became apparent in the precision of his movements, the deliberate calm of his stance, and the quiet strength of his presence. Every observer, whether in person or through later retellings, would sense the contrast. The young officer, rigid and uncertain, grappling with bias. Marcus, composed and commanding, embodying the principle that integrity is the ultimate authority. The encounter was no longer about a single misjudgment. It had evolved into a vivid demonstration of systemic injustice and moral accountability. The first signs of acknowledgement appeared. A senior officer arrived on the scene, drawn by protocol but also by instinct, assessing the situation. His presence shifted the dynamics subtly but significantly. He questioned the actions of the young officer, citing regulations, legal procedures, and moral responsibility. The young officer faltered, his training insufficient to counter the moral clarity before him. Marcus, standing resolute, did not speak. He had already conveyed the lesson: integrity outweighs assumption, courage outweighs intimidation, and truth outweighs prejudice. As the tension mounted, the broader message crystallized. Every individual on the street, every observer peering through curtains or watching from their cars, began to recognize the fragility of assumptions. Marcus's quiet authority illuminated the dangerous consequences of bias. Systems designed to enforce law and order could perpetuate injustice when those within them allowed perception to substitute for understanding. The encounter became a lesson in empathy, accountability, and the slow, deliberate dismantling of systemic prejudice. In that charged, cinematic moment, Marcus's presence alone was a force. He embodied resilience, moral clarity, and the quiet power of experience. The young officer's hesitation reflected the beginning of awareness, the first steps toward understanding that authority is not merely a badge, a weapon, or a uniform. It is exercised responsibly, ethically, and with recognition of human complexity. The street, momentarily frozen in tension, became a stage for truth, for justice, and for the subtle yet undeniable triumph of integrity over prejudice. The street seemed to contract, the air thick with a silence heavier than any noise could have created. Every observer felt the weight of what had been unfolding. Marcus Thompson, four-star general of the United States Army, stood upright, composed, every inch the embodiment of honor and experience. And yet, moments ago, a man in uniform had assumed superiority over him simply because of the color of his skin. The officer's certainty, once unshakable, now wavered under the undeniable presence of truth. Every medal, every stripe, every mark of service gleamed not as decoration, but as evidence, a testament to a lifetime of sacrifice, discipline, and moral courage. The young officer's fingers trembled slightly on the holster. His voice, once commanding and filled with the conviction of assumed authority, now faltered. Marcus had not raised his voice, had not gestured angrily, had not threatened or even scowled. He had only stood, upright, resolute and calm, allowing his presence and the quiet weight of integrity to communicate more powerfully than any words could. The realization struck the officer like a wave. He had judged based on assumptions, acted based on prejudice, and momentarily subverted justice in pursuit of imagined authority. Every member of the crowd sensed the moral reversal. The person assumed guilty, vulnerable, and subordinate was, in fact, the one who commanded legitimacy and respect. The person wielding authority without understanding, without empathy, without awareness, was suddenly exposed. The young officer's colleagues looked on, murmuring to each other, witnessing the fragility of assumptions and the consequences of bias. The lesson was unavoidable, dramatic, and painfully vivid. Power without integrity is hollow, prejudice without reflection is destructive, and appearances can deceive even those who trust them most. Marcus reached slowly for his phone, the gesture deliberate. He did not speak. The action itself communicated the necessary authority. Within moments, a senior officer arrived, called by protocol, verifying Marcus's identity, credentials, and record. The young officer had no choice but to step back. His hands dropped from the holster, shame flooding his posture. He had wielded authority recklessly, relying on perception rather than principle, and the reality of his misjudgment could not be undone. The senior officer examined Marcus with careful attention, nodding slightly as he confirmed the general's distinguished record. The young officer's face grew red, both from embarrassment and the dawning recognition of the error he had made. Authority, he now realized, was not about controlling those around you. It was about responsibility, fairness, and discernment. Marcus's calm, unwavering demeanor highlighted the stark contrast between those who act from prejudice and those who act from principle. Marcus's gaze scanned the street. He did not look at the officer with anger or disdain. He looked at him with clarity, teaching without words, demonstrating without force, exposing without humiliation. The lesson was subtle, profound, and public. Actions and assumptions matter more than appearances. Morality outweighs authority. And prejudice is a trap that diminishes both the judge and the judged. The officer's moral disorientation became visible, a reflection of the subtle yet pervasive patterns of systemic bias. The crowd, though silent, absorbed every detail. Every observer understood on some level the gravity of what had almost occurred. They had witnessed the near arrest of a man who had devoted his life to service, a man whose achievements demanded respect and whose integrity demanded acknowledgement. The officer, though trained to enforce order, had acted from an assumption rooted in bias. The moral reversal was clear. The one judged as lesser was, in fact, the embodiment of courage, discipline, and authority, while the one presumed righteous was exposed as flawed, overconfident, and unprepared to confront the truth. Marcus's hand rested lightly on his phone, a quiet reminder of accountability. The young officer realized, painfully, that Marcus had not needed to raise his voice, threaten arrest, or display power to assert control. Power had existed in preparation, in composure, and in moral clarity. Authority exercised without wisdom is fragile. Authority exercised with integrity is unshakable. The lesson unfolded slowly, painfully, and irrevocably before every witness. As the senior officer stepped closer, he addressed the young officer directly, questioning the logic of the initial arrest attempt, citing protocol and law, and emphasizing the moral and legal implications of assumptions rooted in prejudice. The young officer's posture shifted from defensiveness to submission. For the first time, he faced the consequences not of formal punishment, but of exposure, social, moral, and personal. The realization that his actions had been influenced more by bias than by reason struck with a clarity that no lecture could have conveyed. Marcus remained composed, silent, an anchor in the storm of moral revelation. His eyes scanned the crowd again, noting the subtle changes in expressions, shock, recognition, embarrassment, and, in some, a flicker of inspiration. He understood the power of the moment. This was not only about the near arrest of a single individual. It was about the exposure of systemic flaws, the danger of assumptions, and the transformative potential of calm authority. In one street, in one confrontation, a truth long ignored was made undeniable. The young officer finally lowered his gaze. His confidence, once solid, had eroded under the weight of reality. He had acted without understanding, judged without inquiry, and now faced the consequences of both. Marcus's presence had revealed the hypocrisy of the assumptions, the fragility of prejudice, and the moral imperative to act responsibly. The reversal was complete. The man presumed powerless had demonstrated true authority, while the one presumed dominant was humbled by his own ignorance. Marcus lifted his head slightly, acknowledging the senior officer's confirmation of his credentials. The young officer's hands dropped fully to his sides. Every muscle in his body reflected tension, shame, and a dawning comprehension. The lesson was not about punishment, nor about revenge. It was about accountability, integrity, and the quiet, undeniable power of truth. The crowd, now fully aware, began to exhale collectively, the tension dissipating into awareness. The transformation was subtle yet profound. Prejudice confronted, authority questioned, and integrity validated. For Marcus, the experience was not merely personal. It was emblematic of a lifetime navigating systemic bias, challenging assumptions, and embodying principles that few could understand without living them. He understood that the moment on the street would ripple outward, a lesson in classrooms, offices, and homes, in the hearts and minds of those who observed, and in the conscience of the young officer himself. The impact was moral, social, and deeply human. The night air was still, yet it carried the reverberations of revelation. Marcus's composure remained unbroken, a testament to decades of discipline and service. The young officer had been confronted not by anger, but by quiet authority, not by threat, but by the undeniable truth of achievement, sacrifice, and moral fortitude. The audience, both present and future, would carry this lesson as a reminder that integrity, patience, and composure are more powerful than assumptions, appearances, or unexamined authority. As Marcus turned slowly to leave, the young officer's gaze followed him. For the first time, recognition and respect replaced suspicion. The moral lesson had been delivered in full. Authority is not inherited, it is earned. Assumptions are dangerous, their consequences profound. Integrity prevails when prejudice falters. The night had revealed not only a personal near injustice, but a societal truth, the fragility of prejudice and the enduring power of truth. The city resumed its quiet hum, yet nothing would be the same. The encounter had illuminated the moral landscape of authority, bias, and accountability. Marcus's presence, silent yet commanding, had transformed perception, challenged assumption, and validated integrity. The lesson lingered like the final notes of a symphony, unspoken yet undeniable, leaving every observer, every participant, and even the young officer forever altered. By the time Marcus Thompson returned to his home, the encounter had already begun to ripple across the city. Social media platforms buzzed with videos, eyewitness accounts, and commentary. The footage showed a man in uniform, a young officer, hesitating before the general. The hashtags and headlines captured only fragments of the story, but they conveyed the essence: a near mistaken arrest, a confrontation, and the undeniable presence of injustice. People debated and argued, expressing outrage, astonishment, and, in some cases, shame. Many viewers recognized in themselves the same assumptions that had nearly fueled an act of injustice. Others saw in Marcus a living testament to resilience and integrity, proof that courage and moral clarity could confront systemic prejudice without raising a hand in anger. Marcus, however, did not seek attention. The news and commentary were distractions, momentary reflections of a broader lesson. He reflected quietly on the young officer, wondering whether this experience would transform his perspective, whether the humiliation and revelation of bias would catalyze real change, and whether accountability could be internalized without resentment. The encounter had been more than a confrontation. It had been an opportunity to illuminate the mechanisms of systemic bias and to demonstrate the transformative power of integrity. Marcus understood that this moment could inspire awareness not only for the officer, but for every person who witnessed the event. In the days following the incident, Marcus received messages from veterans, colleagues, and strangers alike. Many thanked him for demonstrating the quiet power of composure and for providing a public example of ethical authority. Some admitted their own implicit biases, acknowledging the ease with which assumptions can cloud judgment. Others expressed admiration for the calm courage he displayed in the face of potential injustice. Marcus read each message carefully, aware that the impact of his actions extended far beyond the immediate scene. The encounter had become a lens through which society could examine its assumptions, prejudices, and obligations to fairness. The young officer requested a formal meeting. He arrived with a mixture of anxiety, humility, and a desire to understand the depth of the mistake he had made. Marcus welcomed him, not with anger, but with a quiet expectation that the lesson learned would not remain a fleeting embarrassment, but a catalyst for personal growth and professional accountability. In their conversation, the officer admitted the assumptions that had influenced his actions, the weight of systemic bias in his training, and the gap between authority and understanding. Marcus listened, offering guidance without condescension, emphasizing that recognition of fault is the first step toward meaningful change. The meeting also became a reflection on the broader societal context. Marcus shared experiences from his career, recounting moments in which prejudice had attempted to define his value, where assumptions had undermined fairness, and where integrity had become the only tool to navigate systemic bias. He spoke of the responsibility that comes with visibility, the necessity of moral clarity, and the importance of mentoring those who might one day wield authority. The young officer absorbed these lessons, recognizing the gap between formal training and lived experience, and understanding that authority without accountability is insufficient to sustain justice. Beyond individual growth, the encounter sparked conversations in the wider community. Neighborhood organizations, civic groups, and educational forums seized the story as an opportunity to discuss racial bias, accountability in law enforcement, and the subtle mechanisms of systemic prejudice. Workshops and discussions explored the ways in which assumptions influence decisions, the moral responsibility of those in positions of power, and the social consequences of unchecked bias. Marcus's experience became a catalyst for societal reflection, demonstrating that even small interventions can illuminate patterns of injustice that are often invisible. The incident also reverberated within Marcus's own circles. Fellow veterans and military leaders recognized the subtle power of his approach, the ability to confront prejudice without aggression, to assert authority without intimidation, and to maintain integrity while exposing systemic flaws. His example became a touchstone for discussions about leadership, ethics, and the moral obligations inherent in positions of influence. Marcus's life, already marked by achievements and accolades, now carried an additional lesson, proof that the principles he embodied could transform public understanding and inspire moral reflection. Yet Marcus's reflection was not solely celebratory. He understood that the encounter had exposed deeper societal vulnerabilities. The young officer's assumptions were not isolated. They were symptomatic of training, culture, and social conditioning that prioritize authority and perception over inquiry and morality. The near arrest revealed how quickly justice can be subverted by prejudice, how easily a person's life can be threatened by assumptions, and how essential vigilance, composure, and accountability are in confronting systemic inequities. The encounter was both a victory and a warning, a demonstration of moral courage and a reminder of persistent societal challenges. Marcus continued to reflect on the lessons for the broader public. How often are assumptions allowed to dictate actions? How frequently do systemic structures permit bias to influence outcomes? The incident on the quiet street had become a microcosm of these larger issues, a narrative in which one man's integrity confronted institutional and personal bias, demonstrating the potential for transformation through moral clarity. Marcus understood that change is not immediate, but visible examples, like the one he had embodied, could create ripple effects that slowly alter perception, decision-making, and culture. In the end, the story left a lingering question for all who witnessed or heard it. Would you have treated him differently? Would you have paused to question your assumptions before acting? Marcus's experience became an enduring testament to the quiet power of integrity, the necessity of vigilance against bias, and the potential for individual action to illuminate systemic flaws. The moral impact was profound. Integrity can confront injustice, patience can diffuse tension, and calm authority can expose truth in ways that force reflection and inspire change. As Marcus walked through his neighborhood again, days later the street seemed different. Neighbors greeted him with recognition, not only for his military service, but for the moral lesson he had demonstrated. The young officer, now more thoughtful and reflective, had begun engaging in conversations about bias and responsibility within his department. Social discussions continued to echo, emphasizing the importance of accountability, empathy, and integrity in all positions of power. The incident had transcended its immediate context to become a lesson for an entire community, a reflection of what happens when courage, principle, and moral clarity meet injustice head-on. The encounter ended without fanfare, yet its impact lingered. Marcus understood that real change is incremental, that societal transformation occurs not only through legislation, but through awareness, reflection, and personal accountability. The near arrest became a catalyst, a moment in which injustice was confronted, assumptions were challenged, and integrity prevailed. In that quiet, transformative night, a street had become a stage for morality, authority, and the enduring struggle against systemic prejudice. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on justice, prejudice, and the power of integrity, subscribe to my channel, Racism Untold Stories, for more stories that reveal truth, expose injustice, and inspire reflection.